Hello and welcome to this Blue Talk with Leo Heller. Leo Heller was the second UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation. He was appointed by the Human Rights Council in November 2014, serving his mandate until 2020. Previously, Leo Heller was professor at the Department of Sanitary and Environmental Engineering at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil, from 1990 to 2014. Currently, Leo Heller is leading researcher at the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation in Brazil and visiting professor at King's College in London. He has extensively experience in teaching and researching in the field of water and sanitation, and he's author of some 250 books, book chapters, and journal articles, including the book The Human Right to Water and Sanitation, published by Cambridge University Press. Leo Heller also has a long tradition of working together with Leo Heller also has a long tradition of working together with and taking part in social movements related to human rights to water and sanitation, especially in Latin America. And last but not least, Leo Heller is an ambassador for the Blue community. Leo Heller, hello and welcome to this Blue Talk. As a leading researcher at the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation in Brazil, and now for 7 months, you told me, a visiting professor at King's College in London, what's the focus of your research and teaching these days?
Hello, Roland. It's a pleasure to be here and to have this talk. Let me explain. I'm a professor in Brazil and a researcher since the 1990s, and my research always will have been on water and sanitation, addressing different aspects of water and sanitation. Even when I was the special rapporteur at the UN, I never stopped to research. I never abandoned this activity, although with less frequency at that time. During my mandate at the UN and after that, I have been trying to include increasingly the framework of the human rights to water and sanitation in my research. And I would group the set of researchers that I'm conducting into different groups, I would say. The first one is addressing the situation of population living in vulnerability, people in vulnerable conditions. So we have a group of research that address, for instance, people living in rural areas, in remote areas, homeless people in Brazil, indigenous peoples. We had a research, for instance, with women in prisons, incarcerated women. So in this group, we are trying to address particular people in very, very vulnerable situations in order to understand how they access or not services of water and sanitation, and what are the challenges, of course, to include those populations in the services access. The other type of research is about policies, public policies, and the idea here is to see in which extent the human rights to water and sanitation can be a framework to inform policies, to formulate policies, and on the other hand, in which extent the policies in place are not complying with this framework. In Brazil, currently, there is a strong process of privatization of services. We can discuss this with more length further. And when I say policy in Brazil, this means the massive transferring of public services to the private sector. And this is something that I'm giving a strong focus on the research to understand this process in Brazil and how this process may affect the enjoyment of the human rights in those communities where the privatization is taking place. So in the second branch of the research on human rights, policy is the main focus, and particularly in Brazil, the privatization process. In London, where I am today as a visiting professor at King's College, my project is basically about this process of privatization in Brazil. And we are trying to understand in different ways. We have here in London 5 sub-projects, each of these addressing certain areas in Brazil where privatization is taking place, but also to understand the financialization of the services. There is a strong concentration of providers on the hands of 5 big companies. And what is the impact of this? This is called by the economists oligopolization. So in which extent this concentration, this oligopolization can affect services in a way that it aligns with the human rights to water and sanitation. So these are my focus today, my main focus today. And I think this can have some relevance because the situation in Brazil now is a unique situation globally. There is no other country with this massive delegation of services to the private sector.
Right. Let's come back to Brazil in a moment and to Latin America in general. Maybe first a bit back to your UN mandate that you mentioned and the more than 250 publications that you had in the past. When you look back all these years and all your career and the years you were the UN representative, where do we stand today in the light of all the past efforts? Do you see any development, any progress for the water as a human right, or how would you assess the general situation at the moment?
Yeah, this is not an easy question to respond because we can look at this through different lenses. I like the idea of the glass half full of water. We can look at the half part or full or empty part of the glass. In terms of the full part of the glass, what we can see, there are some countries that included the human rights to water and sanitation in the constitution or in the law, even if it's not in the constitution, the regulations have been including. There are some progresses in terms of highlighting the needs of population vulnerability, for instance, indigenous populations. In Brazil, we have different groups of population that are reminiscent of slaves, and I see that in Brazil, these are gaining more prominence, and homeless populations, etc. So I can identify in some countries that this concern has a more relevance in terms of the policies. There are some efforts of planning in the water and sanitation sector, and in the planning, not necessarily the human rights is explicitly mentioned, but elements of the human rights are there. For instance, affordability is a very big issue, but also the inclusion of these vulnerable communities. So we can see some progress. It is clear. I will not say that we are at the same page as 20 years ago or since 2010 when the resolution was adopted. But there is a big gap to be filled in different aspects. if we look, for instance, to the monitoring of the SDGs through GMP, what we can see that exactly what I'm saying. If we look at 2015 and today, there is a progress worldwide in water, sanitation, and hygiene, but the gap from today to 2030, where the world is supposed to universalize the access, the gap is too big. And the conclusion now, I think it's very, very clear that the world will not meet the goals. So this is the issue. Yeah, there are progress, but the progress is not in the pace that they are supposed to have. And what will happen in the future is something open, in my opinion. But we need to be, in a certain way, optimists and not only to see this empty part of the glass. So, yes, I'm confident that things will improve increasingly, but unfortunately, not in a pace that is the most desirable. And particularly in countries that are facing economic crisis, that are still very poor, and there is a big contingent of the population without adequate access. I think that the international cooperation or development cooperation is not doing the best work they are supposed to do. I had two reports actually, when I was rapporteur about exactly development cooperation, and I could identify that human rights, water and sanitation is almost absent in the policies and the programs. Even if the country that cooperate is strong in terms of human rights, when they go to poor countries, they forget their commitments at the national level. So there are a set of challenges to be faced. And for me, looking at my own reality in Brazil, this advance of the new liberalism in the water sector is something very, very concerning. I think we are going to another direction, not in the direction of complying with the human rights framework.
So if I understand you right, to take up your picture, you would say using the glass, it's slowly filling on a global level, but in some countries it might not be filling so fast, but rather emptying. And you know that the scientists say a glass is always full. Some part is water, some part is air, but there is always something in it. So, but okay,
Exactly.
the air pressure seems rising. Brazil, coming back there, we just saw the COP30 taking place in Belém, so in your home country. Water was almost no issue there. Sanitation was almost no issue there. What are your thoughts on the outcome of this and of the previous COPs, the whole process, particularly regarding to water and sanitation?
Yeah, first of all, I think there is a kind of consensus among the civil society that the outcomes of COP30 was very frustrating. Yeah. Not a very good agreement. It was a very hard negotiation. The outcome of the negotiation was not that great, particularly in terms of in several terms, but in terms of controlling emissions, green gases, not any strong statement in terms of not using oil or reducing oil consumption, but also in terms of adaptation and mitigation, it was weak, in my view. There are some progresses. I'm trying to follow you, for instance, the discussion on health, climate change and health. And people from the health sector are relatively happy with the statements and the negotiations, how the negotiations went. My feeling is that it is a very big conference and lots of money, lots of efforts and expectations. And it's like other big conferences or big events, international events like that. The results are very fragile. The results are not strong enough. There are some countries that I would say have the capacity to veto some advances in these agreements. And we saw in Belém countries that are oil producers put barriers on more advanced agreements, declarations, etc. So I think these events are important. I think they need to be conducted, but we are not in a good situation globally today in terms of have more advanced agreements. It's important to mention also the position of the United States. We can't look at this event without looking at the main oil consumer and the main country that impacts the drivers of climate change. In terms of water sanitation, again, very, very weak, very absent of the discussions. It's not something that is top in the agenda of the climate narrative, the climate language, and which is a problem, a big problem, because in one hand, particularly wastewater can be a source of climate change, climate warming, and I think most important than that, the climate change can have a huge impact on the access of populations to water, particularly to water. With scarcity and flooding, etc., etc. We are seeing that worldwide in several situations, in several countries, in several moments, how this is impacting. So this is directly related to health, directly related to quality of life. And we saw in Brazil, for instance, 2 years ago, in the south, a rich state in Brazil, Rio Grande do Sul, where for months population has no access to water in an adequate way because of flooding, a strong flooding. And when we look to who were most affected by this process, we clearly see that where the population living in vulnerability. So the climate change adds a new layer of vulnerability in those that has limited access to housing, to health care, to water and sanitation, to transport, etc. So it's a new layer that aggravate the others drivers of vulnerability. So yeah, my view is that should be stronger the agreements around water and sanitation, but it's not so sexy for in these negotiations to include this topic.
Mm. Looking at the host country and your home country, Brazil, it looks a bit like contradictory to me as Brazil's president, Lula da Silva. On the one side, he promotes environmental protection and talks about the end to fossil fuels. On the other hand, however, highways are built through the Amazon and new licenses are being granted to big international oil companies. What's your assessment? What do you make out of this policy in Brazil?
Yeah, Brazil is the country of contradictions, yeah, I would say. Yeah, I think President Lula has good intentions in several of his policies, but he's very constrained by the political arena in the country. The Congress is very, very conservative, dominated by very bad economic interests, agribusiness, business, mining. They are all infused in the discussions in the Congress. There is an assessment that we now have the worst Congress in the history of Brazil after the democratization. And we can see daily, we see decisions of the parliament that are very, very conservative. And I would say in the far right direction. But even Lula's governments, there are some internal contradictions because Lula needed to have some alliances with the conservative area in the country. There are some ministers that come from right-wing parties. And even if the Minister of the Environment is a great person, Marina Silva, she has a history of struggle in favor of the environment, she's alone sometimes. Let me give you an example. 1 week before the COP30, the parliament adopted a law flexibilizing the environmental licensing and opening the door for oil exploration in the mouth of the Amazon, very close to Belém. So this was a clear contradiction of the Brazilian government that was hosting the COP30. So that's it. Lots of contradictions, lots of, from one side, good intentions, good policies, but for the other side, retrogressions, clear retrogressions, which is a pity because Lula could be a champion on environmental protection in a country where we have the Amazon and several other biomes that are very relevant for the conservation and including fighting against the climate change. But in the end, the result is not positive in my view.
We just recently had Lenina here in Europe. She's a deputy in Minas Gerais, and she was talking about the attempts to privatize water and sanitation in Minas Gerais, in this state of Brazil. Is like every state can do what he wants, and the central government and President Lula has basically no power on that? Or how do you see this dynamic going on in Brazil? Who is the driving forces behind it? You mentioned some companies in Brazil that you are analyzing.
Yeah. No, it's not that linear, this process, because everything related to the recent wave of privatization in Brazil started in 2020 with the adoption of a law. It was not in Lula's government, it was in Bolsonaro's government. And this law opened the door for increasing privatization in the country. And privatization is taking place in different ways. You mentioned Minas Gerais, that is my state. And there, the government is trying to sell the state company. This selling of state companies took place in São Paulo, that is the biggest state in the country, and also in Rio Grande do Sul. And in other states, privatization is taking place through concessions. So the idea of this law is to regionalize the state in blocks of municipalities and to delegate the services of these blocks, these regions, to private companies. So this took place in different states, Rio de Janeiro, some states in the Northeast, some states in the north of the country. This is a massive process taking place in a very fast pace. Our numbers show that in 2020, around 10% of the Brazilian population was attended by private companies in terms of water and sanitation, and today it is more than 50. So we had 40 percentage points in the increase in the private participation in only 5 years. So this is massive, and it's very difficult to control, very difficult to learn with experience. This is very important because the learning process is very important to see how to contract, how to design the contracts, how to regulate the companies, and so on. The issue of Minas Gerais is in place. I think, unfortunately, that will be approved. And as São Paulo, Minas Gerais will sell a very, very good company, Copasa. Copasa has provision of water in around 700 municipalities and sanitation in, I think, around 400 municipalities. So it's a big, big company. And one interesting thing of these state companies do is to practice the so-called cross subsidies. Cross subsidies meaning that big cities that have a superavit in terms of revenues can transfer this superavit to small cities where the service is very difficult to be sustainable in terms of economics. So with the privatization, we will lose part of these cross subsidies, and poor municipalities, small municipalities can be in problems. So again, a process of concentration of good services on those that can pay for them and bad services for those that can't pay for them. So the impacts of the privatization in Brazil, I think, will be very, very strong and affecting particularly people in vulnerability. I can give you another element that is the services of water sanitation in rural areas. Rural water and rural sanitation is something absent in all policies ever. And with the privatization, what we are seeing is that many contracts to the private company exclude the rural areas. So the private provider will not attend to the rural areas, and they will be in the hands of the state without sufficient money, sufficient budget to do the services. And I think that the situation of the rural populations in Brazil will be worse and worse in terms of access to these essential services. So the impact on the human rights, I think, will be massive in the country. But we are studying. I'm just anticipating some possible outcomes of our research.
Latin America has a long tradition of water fights for water justice, but still, if I look at the Latin American context in general, also like in Argentina, President Milei is privatizing water. In Bolivia, there are now steps towards it. Where is this whole wave of privatization coming from? What's the driving force behind all that? And maybe also what can water justice movements do to fight against and to defend water as a public good?
Yeah, I'll say that Latin America is very diverse. I don't think there is a regional trend in the region, because, as I said, Brazil is a very unique case. I don't think that we can extrapolate what is taking place in Brazil to other Latin American countries. Argentina is another case. It's a different case, but it's another concerning case. I agree, because Argentina learned that privatization is not a good way and canceled the contract in Buenos Aires and in other regions of the country. And now, not surprisingly, Milei is again with the same idea to transfer the Buenos Aires system to the private sector. Maybe he will succeed because he won the last elections for the parliament, and maybe he has majority in the parliament to adopt this type of policies. In the other countries, I think we have a mosaic of situations, not a pattern. And Mexico is different, Colombia is different, Bolivia had a very, very traumatic experience in La Paz, Cochabamba, El Alto, but now the far right, the right wing government is back in the government, so not sure what the government will do. But what the trend depends not only, in my view, on the government, but also in the companies. The economic interest of the companies to invest here and not there. What we are seeing in Brazil is that the companies that are providing services are extremely financialized. So financialization is one of the elements of this process nowadays. And financializing meaning that the company has other interests in providing services than the provision of services themselves. They want to reproduce the capital of the investors. And many companies in Brazil are the owners are investment funds and pension funds, and some of them have shares in the float market. So what is the interest of those funds that are investing in the sector? Only to have a short-term gain in terms of the investments, and not to provide water, and not to look at the human rights framework. So these companies, I have doubts even if a country like Bolivia or Ecuador or Paraguay open the policy to privatization, it's not clear to me if they will invest there, because they require a stable legal environment, a stable institutional environment, in order to reduce the risks. The way these companies think is to manage risks, and if the economic risks are high, they will avoid to invest. Not only to invest, to sign a 35 years contract to provide services in the certain region. In Brazil, this is interesting. I think this is a learning process also, because in Brazil, the companies appeared interested in providing services after 2020, when a law was adopted by the parliament, because in their view, and this is the discourse of the companies, of the private sector, the law gave a legal stability for the contracts, and no question can be there after this. That is a kind of not necessarily true, because there are risks, and this is what we are trying to understand. There are risks. Climate change is a risk, and with extreme scarcity of water, the revenue can drop dramatically. Protests from the users are a risk for the companies. Different regulations can be a risk. The company, when sign a contract, have a commitment to invest and to meet some goals in terms of coverage that is not easy to comply with, and there is also a risk. So this is what we are trying to understand, how the companies manage those risks and what the reality will show in terms of the stability of the provision so far. So I'm divagging a little bit to answer your question about Latin America, but yeah, we need to follow up, and I'm sure that environmental justice movements have an important role to play in this process, denouncing, showing the failed experience in the past, showing how particularly the North countries are remunicipalizing services and not privatizing services, and why they are remunicipalizing services. And this is a political struggle to be established in terms of, in the end, what we are talking about is how to comply with the human rights commitments of the country, and not to go in the other direction.
being now as a visiting professor based in London at the King's College, UK is a pretty good example for the disaster privatization is causing. I mean, that's should be a global lesson to be learned, but obviously, looking the debate on global scale from the World Bank down to whomever, they're still always talking about money. It's always about, you mentioned financialization, commodification of water. The debate always seems to be we just have to bring enough money in and then we can fix all these problems. What do you make out of this?
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a sometimes a fallacious narrative because usually the private company doesn't bring new money. They use the money from the users or they use the money from the national banks with subsidies in the interest rates. And it's not true. This is the main narrative to justify the privatization in Brazil. The state can't invest in water and sanitation. We need to bring private money, and this is not necessarily true. I think that the UK example is a good case to show that because the companies are in debt, they are not investing, the salaries of the CEOs are extremely high. The proportion with the salaries of the CEOs of the company and the normal worker is something scandalous. It's hundreds times more, and no investments at all. I need to mention that we have a project together with Ondas. Ondas is a Brazilian NGO that works with environmental justice, the National Observatory of the Rights of Water and Sanitation. So it is a joint project from Cruz, where I worked in Brazil, and Ondas, and we try to uncover parts of this process. We are publishing a book that's an outcome of this research. Why I'm talking about that? Because one of the chapters of the book is about exactly the UK case written by the colleagues from Greenwich, David Hall, Emmanuel Lobina. And it's a very interesting chapter because it shows how uh, Thatcher privatized the service in 1990, around that. So 35 years ago. Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to understand. Yeah, 35 years ago. So 35 years after this decision, the country is facing a big problem, and it's a clearly a failed uh, process, particularly in London and the region of London with Thames Water. And what to do after that? How the government can change and can revoke the contracts, etc. It's not easy because even if the Labour Party, in some moments, considered this possibility of re-estatizing the services, what we see it's not a simple thing because there is a big discussion about indemnization, a big discussion on how to reorganize the public service again, contracting people, specialists, etc., etc., and the risk of remunicipalization can uh, take place because you can have some discontinuity in the service provision, etc., etc. Although we know several countries did that, France and some cities in the US, and it can be a smooth process, but it's not easy to take the decision and to implement the decision to re-municipalize or re-estatize the services. And I think this will be the case in Brazil. 35 years is the average of the duration of the contract. So one governor or one mayor decides to privatize the services, and this decision will take 9 following terms in terms of impact. And if someone in the future decides, oh, this was a wrong decision, let's go back, it's not easy. It's not easy because the contracts, yeah, this is another issue. The contracts often has very important guarantees for the companies. and because otherwise they will not embark in this adventure of providing services. And there are several safeguards in the contracts in order to avoid the cancel of the contract in the future. So, yeah, this is the world that we are. Fortunately, many other countries learned with these bad experiences and these are now strengthening the public provision of services.
As a professor, you're researching, you're teaching, you're providing expertise and content. You're also a Blue Community Ambassador. What can Blue communities do about all this situation and for the human right to water and sanitation? What's the role of the Blue community? What do you think?
Yeah, there are several roles, there are important roles that I think can be adopted. One is to to disseminate what is the meaning of the human rights to water and sanitation to a broad audience, civil society, governments, parliamentarians, and academics, because it is still a concept not very much disseminated and appropriated by the society. Second is to show how to implement. I know this is not simple because the implementation of the human rights of sanitation is very contextual. It depends on the context, the forces in places, the needs in places, etc. But to promote some good practices, to show how good practices can be implemented, even if it's a very specific, very punctual practice, I think it's important for an organization like the Blue Community. And also the political arena. I think I always believed that the main struggle is at the political arena, occupying the streets when necessary, lobbying with the parliamentarians, lobbying with the governments, naming and shaming when it is the case. So I think there is Blue Community is doing a good job, but there is a good portfolio to implement and to improve in what the Blue communities have been done. Yeah, that's it.
Wonderful. Is there anything we did not talk about, something that is at your heart, in your brain, something you find important to add to our talk?
Not necessarily. I think that the main issue now is related to human rights, water and sanitation. I think there is an enormous space of advancing this issue. And I'm really convinced that this framework of the human rights, water and sanitation can be a turning point in terms of providing services to the populations, because it illuminates some aspects of the provision of services that are not frequent, are not usually visible for the main actors, the main stakeholders in a certain context. For instance, the issue of equality and non-discrimination, it's very, very strong when we put this issue as the driver of the service provision is very, very strong. But also the issue of affordability, accountability are very essential issues that can be, as I said, turning points in terms of a more equal and fair and just provision of services for all.
Wonderful. Leo Heller, thank you very much for this Blue Talk with you. We will for sure follow up on your research, on your publications. Keep us informed on what you do. The Blue community is always glad to see new inputs coming in. So thank you for this talk, and all the best wishes for your winter time in London.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you.